The floorboard gave a tiny, sharp creak in the dead of the night. A cold wind pushed through a bedroom window that was securely locked just hours ago. In the deep dark of suburban California in the mid-1970s, a terrifying nightmare was walking right into quiet family homes across Sacramento County. Imagine lying in your own bed, the one place you should feel totally safe, and hearing the soft drag of rubber-soled shoes on the carpet. This is how the fight started for dozens of people who woke up to a bright flashlight shining right in their eyes. A man holding a stolen .38 caliber revolver was standing over them, ready to take away their peace forever. That awful sound in the dark was just the first move of a shadow who knew exactly how to break into a home without making a single sound. He would pry open sliding glass doors off their tracks, unscrew porch bulbs to kill the light, and map out perfect escape routes through the dense neighborhood greenbelts. Very quickly, this pure fear spilled out of the bedrooms and gripped whole towns like Rancho Cordova and Carmichael. Neighbors who used to wave across fences stopped trusting the quiet night. People rushed to local hardware stores to buy extra deadbolt locks, heavy wood broomsticks for sliding doors, and aggressive guard dogs to protect their families. Entire streets kept their porch lights burning at full brightness until the sun came up. Families were wide awake, with fathers holding loaded shotguns and baseball bats in the dark. Neighborhood watch groups patrolled the sidewalks, but it felt like a whole town was bracing for a heavy punch they could not see coming. Down at the Sacramento County Sheriff's Department, the men and women wearing badges felt a crushing weight on their chests. They were working day and night on massive task forces, but it felt like they were blindfolded, swinging wildly at smoke. Every time they rushed to a house and thought they had him trapped in a backyard perimeter, he was already gone. The cops stared at empty fields and broken wooden fences, feeling sick to their stomachs as K-9 units lost the scent at nearby drainage ditches. They knew another family would be hurt if they did not catch him, and that dark truth kept them awake for days. They wanted to protect their towns, but the man always stayed one step ahead on a stolen bicycle. That heavy feeling of failing to catch a ghost pushed the police to look much harder at the bizarre clues he left behind. Investigators began mapping out his geographic timeline, linking his movements across different jurisdictions, and realizing that this terrifying intruder possessed a level of meticulous preparation they had rarely encountered. Looking closely at his past moves, the police saw a scary set of steps. He did not start his crime spree with the absolute worst acts. Instead, he trained for them over several years, practicing his dark moves like a twisted game during a string of over 100 burglaries in the town of Visalia. First, he just watched houses from the bushes and broke a few windows. Then he started sneaking inside to steal small things, learning exactly how families moved and slept. Finally, he began waking people up, tying their hands with complex diamond knots, and hurting them in terrible ways while stacking teacups on their backs as an early warning system. This slow step up in violence showed the police they were hunting someone who planned every single detail of his attacks. He conducted extensive pre-attack reconnaissance, learned family work schedules, and even crept into homes days in advance to quietly unlock specific windows and secretly unload the personal firearms of his future victims. But the most terrifying part of all was how this man could do so much harm and then just melt right back into the suburban shadows. He wore thick gloves, so he left no clear fingerprints on the glass. He wore a ski mask with hand-stitched eye holes, so no survivor could draw a good picture of his face. He never dropped a wallet, a set of keys, or a name tag in the dirt. He was a blank space, leaving behind broken lives and almost no solid clues. It was a puzzle with missing pieces, limited to basic blood typing, just waiting for a big science change in DNA profiling that had not even been invented yet. Because he vanished so completely into the California night, the pain he left behind had nowhere to go, and no bad guy to lock away in a prison cell. The statute of limitations slowly ticked down on 50 separate sexual assaults, leaving thick case files frozen in cold storage cabinets while the attacker walked free. We have to zoom in on the brave people who lived through his attacks. For them, the terrible fight did not end when he finally walked out their front door and disappeared into the night. The horror stayed alive in their minds for decades, forcing many to relocate to entirely different states to escape the haunting memories. Every time a door clicked or a dog barked in the distance, their hearts would beat fast. These survivors carried a heavy, invisible weight every single day, trying to build their lives back up from the ground. They had to be incredibly strong while living with the memory of a monster who sometimes called their home phones to whisper threats. Carrying that deep pain became even harder for the community when the news broke that the masked man in the dark had changed his geographic game again. The attacker moved his operation away from Northern California, traveling hundreds of miles south to wealthy neighborhoods in Santa Barbara and Orange County to begin a new reign of terror. The story took a terrible turn when his crimes went from hurting people to taking their lives completely. The danger jumped from deep fear to total loss of life as he began leaving bodies behind in quiet homes starting in 1979. Police found tiny biological clues at these new, deadly scenes that tied the worst acts right back to the very same shadow. The nightmare escalated in the late 1970s and early 1980s as the attacker moved to Southern California. The perpetrator stopped merely breaking into homes and assaulting residents in Sacramento and the Bay Area. He started taking their lives in Goleta, Ventura, and Irvine. The parameters of his crime shifted from deep psychological pain to total, final loss. Investigators examined the awful crime scenes, noting the specific knots used to bind victims and the distinctive footprints left behind, and they recognized a horrifying truth. It was the exact same man committing these deadly crimes. The geographic shift from home break-ins in the north to brutal murders in the south left the entire state of California frozen in pure panic. Hardware stores sold out of deadbolts and window locks within hours of news broadcasts, while local gun shops reported record sales to terrified citizens who feared their neighborhood would be the next target. Then, in May 1986, following the murder of 18-year-old Janelle Cruz in Irvine, a sudden shock came. The brutal attacks abruptly stopped without any explanation. But this sudden end was not a victory for law enforcement or the terrified public. It became a brand new kind of torture for the detectives looking for him, as the sudden absence of crime scenes meant an absolute halt to fresh evidence, witness statements, and geographical tracking. The investigative trail went completely cold as the months stretched into years. The loud sirens and fresh clues of the active investigation faded into an awful, heavy silence, leaving behind thousands of pages of typewritten reports and dead-end tips. Police task forces kept reviewing the old case files across multiple counties, but there was nothing new left to find. The perpetrator had simply walked away into the dark, leaving behind a massive string of unsolved cases gathering dust in evidence rooms. With no fresh footprints in suburban flower beds and no new taunting phone calls in the middle of the night, the massive multi-jurisdictional hunt hit a frustrating dead end. Detectives watched helplessly as the statute of limitations expired on the early assaults, knowing their only path to justice now relied entirely on solving the homicides. The profound psychological toll of an unsolved serial case creates a terrible feeling of waiting for the next strike. It is a deep, tight knot of anxiety that forms when a lethal threat remains unidentified and entirely free to roam the streets. For the surviving victims and the original investigators who worked the scenes, that feeling of impending doom lasted every single night for over 30 years. This decades-long wait severely tested the psychological endurance of everyone who lived through the original wave of terror. Families continued to double-lock their doors, install expensive alarm systems, and keep baseball bats or firearms near their bedsides, never knowing if the quiet meant they were finally safe, or if the killer was simply resting before launching another calculated series of home invasions. The heavy fear of the unknown became a permanent shadow over their lives, fundamentally altering how an entire generation of Californians raised their children. Parents who had survived the 1970s crime spree passed their hypervigilance down to their kids, teaching them never to trust an open window or a rattling fence gate in the middle of the night. Years later, a revolutionary forensic tool brought a massive spark of hope to the dormant investigation. Biological scientists developed methods to extract and read human DNA from decades-old biological evidence. You can understand this genetic material as a highly specific, microscopic signature unique to only one person on Earth. Every individual leaves this biological signature behind through skin cells, blood, or bodily fluids, creating an undeniable physical link to a specific location. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, forensic technicians possessed the technology to extract these genetic signatures from the degraded evidence kits preserved from the 1970s. In 2001, scientists tested multiple samples and definitively linked the East Area rapist in Sacramento to the original Night Stalker in Southern California. Proving one man committed both crime sprees was a monumental step forward in the long fight for the truth. Extracting that undeniable biological profile from the old rape kits felt like holding a definitive map out of the dark. Unlike the conflicting eyewitness descriptions, the varied composite sketches, or the different shoe sizes reported over the years, the genetic sequence offered a perfect, unchanging mathematical certainty of the attacker's identity. Investigators took this newly isolated genetic profile and uploaded it into CODIS, the National Combined DNA Index System maintained by the FBI. This vast federal database contained the genetic records of millions of convicted felons and recent arrestees from across the United States. Detectives and lab technicians held their breath, waiting for the system to process the sequence and flash a matching name onto the laboratory computer screen. But the federal database returned a crushing answer after scanning millions of criminal records. The system reported 0 matches across the entire country. This bitter letdown hit the dedicated cold case investigators incredibly hard. They possessed the exact biological blueprint that constructed the killer, right down to the microscopic level, but without a matching profile already in the criminal justice system, they still had absolutely no idea what his name was. The severe limitation of the National Criminal Database was that it could only identify individuals who had already been arrested, convicted, and legally swabbed by law enforcement. Because this specific perpetrator had somehow managed to evade capture and felony processing for his entire life, he remained a total ghost in the machine. This created a highly frustrating paradox for the legal system. The exact truth of the killer's identity was sitting right there, safely locked away inside the sub-zero freezers of the Sacramento County Crime Laboratory. The perpetrator's true biological self was trapped inside a tiny plastic centrifuge tube, holding all the answers but remaining completely silent about his street address or his driver's license number. That small vial of extracted genetic material held the key to resolving decades of profound community pain. The sequence contained the exact instructions that built the face of the monster. Yet the biological evidence could not speak a name, and the deep mystery dragged on for another 15 years, forcing original detectives into retirement and leaving surviving victims to wonder if the truth would stay frozen in that laboratory forever. The silent biological clues sat patiently on a refrigerated shelf, perfectly preserved in their chemical buffer solutions, simply waiting for the rest of the world's technology to catch up. Law enforcement had exhausted their traditional forensic tools, meaning any future breakthrough would have to come from an entirely different scientific direction. Far away from the restricted evidence rooms of police stations, a totally new consumer industry was quietly gaining momentum. Regular citizens across the globe were paying for commercial genealogy kits, spitting into little plastic tubes, and mailing them off to private companies. These millions of customers were not looking for criminals. They simply wanted to build their family trees, discover their ethnic origins, and find out exactly where their distant ancestors came from. While the killer's cold blood sat locked inside a forensic freezer, the rest of the world was finding a fascinating new hobby. Regular people started spitting into little plastic tubes and mailing them off to direct-to-consumer testing companies. They just wanted to know exactly where their ancestors came from or if they had undiscovered family members living far away across the sea. It was a fun, innocent game to learn about their past, and absolutely nobody knew these tiny tubes of spit would soon be used to catch a notorious monster. Millions of people eagerly shared their family secrets online, creating a giant interconnected map of human genetics that the police had never seen before. Open-source platforms like GEDmatch allowed anyone to upload their raw genetic data voluntarily, transforming a simple hobby into an unprecedented biological database filled with over 1 million individual profiles. Contra Costa County investigator Paul Holes watched this massive new map grow with intense interest. He had chased the Golden State Killer for his entire professional life, and now his hair was gray and his body was deeply tired from decades of dead ends. He was just weeks away from packing up his desk in March 2018 and retiring for good, but the faces of the victims still kept him awake at night. He simply could not walk away and leave those broken families lingering in the dark forever. He made a quiet, desperate promise to himself that he would try one last, wildly unconventional idea before he turned off his office light for the final time. He decided to use this public family map to hunt the ghost that had haunted California. That final promise pushed him to take a giant, calculated risk with the carefully preserved frozen evidence. The team secured a perfectly preserved DNA sample extracted from the 1980 Ventura double homicide of Lyman and Charlene Smith, knowing that processing it for a genealogy site might consume the last pristine drops of evidence they had left. Paul and his team took the killer's secret biological code out of the freezer and translated it into a complex computer file containing thousands of genetic markers. They did not put it into the restricted FBI database called CODIS this time. Instead, they quietly uploaded the monster's raw data file to the public website GEDmatch, a place where regular people went to find their lost cousins and build their family trees. They knew the killer had never mailed his own spit in a tube, so his exact name would absolutely not be sitting there waiting for them. But they deeply hoped someone in his extended family had played the DNA game. If they could just find a brother, a cousin, or even a distant uncle sharing a tiny percentage of identical genetic material, they could follow the family lines right to the killer's front door. They hit the button to search the massive site, holding their breath as the little loading bar slowly crawled across the computer screen. The complex algorithm began scanning hundreds of thousands of uploaded files, comparing millions of nucleotide pairs, and desperately searching for any mathematical overlap with the killer's unique genetic signature. Suddenly, the computer delivered a sharp notification that echoed in the quiet room. The screen lit up with a list of between 10 and 20 distant relatives, and a shock of pure electricity shot through the tired detectives. They did not see the killer's name, but they saw the highest matches sharing just enough centimorgans of DNA to indicate third or fourth cousins. After 40 years of swinging wildly at shadows in the dark, they finally had a real, tangible thread to pull. These were distant cousins, people who shared the exact same great-great-grandparents as the monster they were hunting. It was a tiny, fragile crack in the wall of a cold case, but it was finally enough to let the light shine in. The dark office suddenly felt incredibly electric, buzzing with the hope of a historical chase that was finally real. The team immediately shifted their focus from traditional forensic science to complex genetic genealogy, bringing in retired patent attorney Barbara Ray Venter to help them navigate this completely uncharted territory and interpret the complicated genetic connections. But the initial notification from the computer was only the start of a very long, incredibly hard road. To find the killer, the team had to build a giant family tree entirely from scratch. They had to dig through dusty archives, analyzing census records from 1900, faded obituary clippings, marriage certificates, and old town papers from the 1800s. They worked backwards in time, meticulously connecting mothers to sons and grandfathers to cousins. Every single person had to be placed on the pedigree chart perfectly, because a single misattributed parentage or unrecorded adoption meant the whole thing would fall apart. It was exactly like trying to put together a puzzle with a million tiny pieces and absolutely no picture on the box to help them. The massive web of names grew substantially larger every single day, stretching across the walls of the room and filling countless digital spreadsheets. They tracked birth dates, death records, and mapped the slow movement of pioneer families migrating from the East Coast toward California over the span of several decades. The human cost of this relentless search was incredibly heavy. The team stared at glowing computer screens for 12 to 14 hours a day until their eyes felt like they were full of sand. They drank old, cold coffee and fought hard against the heavy weight of sleep pulling at their heads, terrified the killer might die of old age before they finished. Their backs ached and their heads pounded from looking at endless rows of dates, names, and historical locations. But they absolutely refused to stop or go home to their beds. They knew the monster was hiding somewhere inside that giant, sprawling tree, and as they eliminated branches leading to women or men of the wrong age, they could feel his breath on their necks. Pushing through the deep physical pain of being so profoundly tired, they finally found the apex root of the family tree and prepared to climb back up. They successfully identified a common ancestral couple born in the early 19th century, giving them the exact historical foundation they needed to trace every modern descendant forward to the present day. Once they found the great-great-grandparents from the old days, they had to flip the whole tree upside down. They started moving forward in time, tracing every single baby born to that family line for over 100 years. They followed every branch, hunting specifically for a white male who grew up to be the right age, living in the exact California towns where the attacks happened in the 1970s. The investigative team had to drastically change direction. Once they identified the grandparents from the early 19th century, they flipped the entire family tree upside down. They meticulously tracked every single child, grandchild, and great-grandchild moving forward in time toward the present day. They were hunting for a specific man who would be the exact right age to commit the crimes during the 1970s and 1980s. They followed hundreds of diverging family branches through the years, pulling census records, marriage licenses, and obituaries. This exhaustive public data search expanded the giant tree until it finally led them to a few living people. The sprawling network of thousands of distant relatives was mathematically narrowed down to a localized geographic region in Northern California. The operations room grew entirely quiet as the team stared at a very small list of names printed on the whiteboard. These were just normal men living quiet, everyday lives in the surrounding suburbs. It was a chilling thought that froze the blood in their veins, realizing that a prolific serial predator was currently paying taxes and renewing his vehicle registration just miles away. One of these totally normal names belonged to a monster responsible for 13 murders and 50 sexual assaults. Pure evil was hiding right there in plain sight, tucked behind a boring everyday identity that no one would ever fear. The man who had terrorized the entire state of California for over a decade was masquerading as a completely ordinary citizen. The crushing weight of the unknown phantom who had haunted investigators for 40 years was finally replaced by the terrifying reality of real faces and real addresses. The abstract genetic markers on a computer screen suddenly transformed into Department of Motor Vehicles photographs, utility bills, and registered property deeds located in the quiet neighborhood of Citrus Heights. Now began the slow, methodical work of crossing names off that short list. They used simple, documented facts to clear the innocent men. One guy was far too young to be the killer, born well after the initial burglaries began. Another man lived in a completely different state when the worst of the home invasions and attacks happened. Step by careful step, they drew a line through name after name by checking military deployment records and verified alibis. The net pulled tighter and tighter around the empty spaces that were left. It was basic logic closing the trap on a ghost, evaluating physical descriptions, eye color, and height parameters established by surviving victims to filter the remaining pool. The piles of cleared files grew tall on the desks as brothers, cousins, and distant uncles were systematically eliminated from the suspect board. After running every possible variable through the established timeline of the East Area rapist attacks, only one single path remained open on this massive genetic tree. Then came the massive shock that stopped everyone in the task force cold. A single name sat alone at the bottom of the list, and that name was Joseph James DeAngelo. Born in 1945, he was living in a modest home just miles from where the initial Sacramento attacks began. But his name was not the thing that made the breath leave their lungs. The true horror was his professional job history, because he was a former police officer. He had served in the Exeter and Auburn police departments during the exact years the crimes escalated from burglaries to violent assaults. The men hunting the monster suddenly realized the monster used to wear the exact same badge they did. The quiet hum of the office died away as the dark truth of his law enforcement past finally sank in. His police background perfectly explained how he continuously evaded capture, bypassed complex alarm systems, understood perimeter containment, and knew exactly how to blind victims with a flashlight while wielding a standard-issue weapon. A deep, heavy sadness filled the room as the investigators connected the dots. The team thought about the terrified victims who had called the police in the middle of the night, begging for help after spotting prowlers. They had no idea that a sworn cop was the very person who was stalking their neighborhoods and hurting them. It was a sickening breaking of the public trust. The man supposed to protect the innocent was the one breaking into their homes and ruining their lives. He likely monitored police radio frequencies and tracked investigation progress from the inside. The badge was just a tactical shield for his dark, calculated crimes. Knowing his secret made the urge to catch him burn hotter than ever before. The FBI, the Sacramento County Sheriff Department, and Contra Costa County investigators immediately coordinated a highly classified surveillance operation. They mobilized a specialized task force to secure the final piece of physical evidence required to close the trap. In the spring of 2018, the police made their final quiet moves. They could not just kick down his door and arrest him on a genetic guess derived from a genealogy website. They needed his actual DNA to prove he was the one, requiring a direct, legally obtained sample to compare against the preserved crime scene evidence. Detectives hid in the shadows outside his house, watching a frail, 72-year-old man yell at his lawnmower. They patiently tracked his movements through the community. When he threw out his trash in a public receptacle, they secretly grabbed a tissue he had used, hoping his biological cells were left behind on the discarded paper. They rushed the stolen trash back to the Sacramento County Crime Lab and waited for the forensic machines to do their magic. Scientists meticulously extracted the genetic profile from the recovered item, preparing to run a direct comparison against the golden standard DNA profile that had been preserved in evidence lockers since 1980. The final moment of the long, exhausting fight had finally arrived on April 24, 2018. The lab results flashed on the screen, showing a 100% match to the crime scene evidence. The Golden State Killer was finally unmasked, sending a huge wave of tears and stunned silence through everyone who had chased him in the dark. The phone call finally came, carrying the heavy weight of 4 decades of pain. The lab results were clear. It was a 100% match. The monster who had haunted California for so long had a name, and he was finally caught. In the room, tough detectives who had chased ghosts for years broke down. Tears fell in stunned silence. The endless nightmare was over. This single moment changed how police hunt criminals forever. The old rules of searching for bad guys were torn up and thrown away. Now a tiny drop of sweat or a single hair left in a dark room could unlock the biggest secrets. Police departments across the whole country saw a brand new tool shine bright. Cold, dusty boxes of forgotten files were pulled out of deep storage. Inside those old boxes lay the hopes of thousands of families waiting for justice. The success of this family tree search lit a fire in cold case rooms everywhere. The invisible web of family ties became a giant net, ready to catch those who thought they had slipped away in the dark. For the brave people who survived his attacks, the news changed their entire world. The heavy fear that had controlled their lives for 40 years began to lift. They were no longer just victims hiding in the dark. They became a strong group standing together in the light, watching as the man who ruined their lives was locked in a cage. This shared pain turned into a powerful bond. Families who had lost mothers, fathers, and daughters finally had an answer to the terrible question of who took them away. They watched the court process unfold, seeing the tired old man face the truth of his cruel acts. The justice system, which had failed to find him for so long, finally worked to keep him behind thick glass and iron bars. The shockwave of his arrest in April 2018 hit the world of science hard. Millions of regular people who had spit in a tube to find their ancestors suddenly realized something huge. Their simple family tests were now part of a massive, shared map of human DNA. Lawmakers and scientists had to scramble to figure out new rules for this surprising power. Websites where people uploaded their family trees had to change their locks. They added new buttons and strict choices, asking users if police could look at their private codes. The hunt for one killer forced the whole country to ask hard questions about privacy. A single drop of blood could now point to a cousin, an uncle, and eventually a suspect hiding in plain sight. Yet, even with the killer caught, a deep, dark question remains open. We know how he was finally trapped by science, but we still do not fully know why he did what he did. The mind of a man who could live a normal life by day and do such evil things by night is a puzzle with missing pieces. No court paper or lab test can truly explain the pure hate that drove him. Experts still study his past, looking for the exact moment a normal boy turned into a monster. They look at his time as a police officer, wondering how the very badge meant to protect people became a shield for his crimes. The science gave us his name, but it cannot map the cold, empty space inside his heart. That chilling mystery will likely stay locked away forever. The lasting mark of this case changed the rules of police work forever. Because of the Golden State Killer, using family trees to catch bad guys became an official, trusted tool. It created a brand new job for clever detectives. Today, special teams work every day just to match old crime scene clues with public family maps. This new tool has cracked hundreds of other cold cases since that day. Killers who thought they got away with murder 20 or 30 years ago are suddenly hearing a knock at their door. The shadows are no longer safe for those who do harm. The science that caught one terrible man has become a bright light chasing away the darkness in towns all across the world. For the families left behind, this bright light brings a quiet, steady comfort. They know that no matter how much time passes, the truth is always waiting in our blood. The pain of the past can never be erased, but the heavy weight of not knowing is finally gone. They can finally breathe, knowing the story ends with truth, not a question mark. In a quiet, locked room, a simple swab of DNA rests in a plastic tube. It is a tiny, invisible thing, yet it held the power to bring down a giant of fear. That small drop of truth broke a 40-year silence, proving that no matter how deep you hide, your own blood will always remember what you did.